And here comes the shocker. Out of nowhere, White's king is now going to be under attack, and Naka played the move queen takes f2. Hey there, in today's video we're going to analyze a very nice game played by top American Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura, who is also a very popular YouTuber in the chess world, and this game features a very nice queen sacrifice. He played this game as black against veteran Polish Grandmaster Michel Krasenkov. This game was played back in 2007 in Barcelona, and here Krasenkov started with the move knight to f3. This opening is called the Zukertort opening, but it is actually a very flexible move. The game might easily transpose into other openings like the king's pawn opening, the queen's pawn opening, or even the English opening as it happened in the game after knight to f6. Here Krasenkov played c4, and in this position Nakamura went for e6, which is a very solid approach even though the game ended up being crazy. Here black has other options like g6 or c5, but e6 makes a lot of sense, trying to go for d5, and after g3 and d5, Krasenkov played bishop to g2, and here Nakamura played bishop to e7. Black has other options, but developing makes a lot of sense. Taking on c4 here, it is possible, but it doesn't win a pawn because after queen to a4, we get this fork, where white easily gets the pawn back. Or another recurring idea in these positions is going d4 if white doesn't go for d4. So here black can play d4 pretty much at any time. This is definitely possible. On one hand, black is gaining space on the center, but white's main idea in these positions is to counterattack the center. Maybe white can castle first, and here normally black tries to hold to the center, but white's idea is to go for e3, then try to get a b4 at the right moment. So white tries to counterattack the center, and another important idea is that now this bishop is going to be quite strong on this diagonal, so playing d4 has some pros and cons. So here Naka went for bishop to e7, and after both sides castled, now here Krasenkov played b3. Here again white can decide to transpose into lines in the queen's pawn opening by going d4, but instead white wants to avoid main theory and went for b3. The idea is simply to vindicate to the bishop, and in this position black has many options. c5 is an interesting move, but Naka played an aggressive move and went for a5. So here the main idea is to play a4. For example, if white just plays routinely by going bishop to b2, here a4 has an idea to undermine white's pawns, and even a3 might be an idea in some lines. For example, if white plays carelessly after a move like knight to c3, a3, black is gaining space, now the bishop has to go back, so this is not very comfortable for white. And by the way, after a move like bishop to b2 and a4, white might take this pawn a4, but first of all, white's pawns have become weakened with these isolated double pawns, so black can easily get that pawn back, for example by going knight b to d7 and then knight to b6. So this is not the nicest extra pawn that white might get. That's why Krasenkov decided to play knight to c3, preventing this a4 idea because now white has the idea to take with knight. So here Naka continued with c6, and now white finally played the move d4, and after knight b to d7, queen to c2, here Naka played the move b6. The bishop cannot develop easily on this diagonal, that's why b6 makes a lot of sense. The main idea in this position is to develop the bishop to a6, putting pressure against c4. And here Krasenkov went for the ambitious e4, which makes a lot of sense. And now Naka continued with his plan and went bishop to a6. So here taking on a4 is quite comfortable for white. White has many options in this position. Knight to g5 might be an idea, knight to e5, or even the simple taking on e4. The point is that after knight takes and queen takes, white is attacking on c6. Black might develop the bishop to b7, but this might be a bit passive. Now white can continue with something like bishop to b2 and rook a to d1. White has definitely more active pieces. That's why Naka decided to go bishop to a6. It makes sense. This pawn on c4 is pinned, so there's some pressure. And in this position, white made a move that I don't really like. Maybe it is a bit too subtle for me, which is the move knight to d2. Just trying to defend the pawn on c4. So here in this position, I think that white should be consistent with the move e4, and follow up with the move e5. So just focus on black side of the board and try to create some potential attacking ideas. Here in this position, if black goes knight to g4, h3 simply attacks the knight, and after knight to e8, white can play something like knight to e2, just defending the pawn on c4, and then follow up with the move h4, trying to expand on the king side. For example, after knight to c7, h4, and we get a very short position where white will try to get some play on the king side, and black will normally try to look for counterplay on the queen side. And this bishop on c1 is actually not that bad here because it is eyeing the king side, and whenever black plays a move like h6, there might be some ideas to sacrifice that bishop. But instead, Krasenkov went for knight to d2, which I honestly consider to be too passive, because now, at the very first opportunity, Naka went for complications trying to get counterplay and play the move c5. By the way, here a quiet move like rook to c8 also makes a lot of sense, but c5 already creates a lot of tension on the center. So here Krasenkov took on d5. Let's evaluate some alternatives. Here the move e5 now is a bit less strong because now black has, in addition to knight to e8, the idea of going knight to g4, because if white plays h3, instead of moving the knight, black can take on d4, counterattacking the knight on c3, and now there's an idea to capture the pawn on e5, so black is already doing better in this position. And here taking on d5 with the c pawn is actually quite bad because, first of all, black can simply win an exchange by taking on f1, or even take on d4 first and then capture the exchange. And there are not many alternatives. Black has this very simple idea of taking on d4. If white takes on c5, black has more than one option, but again, this idea of going d4 is actually quite interesting. Attacking the knight, and after the knight move, just take on c5, for example with the bishop. And by the way, in this position, it seems that white is winning material because there's a discover attack against the rook by going e5. But this is actually quite bad because now we see how black gets a lot of activity in this position. After knight takes e5, if white takes the rook on a8, in addition to taking on a8, which would leave black with a very good position because black gets a bishop and a pawn for the rook, and there's an idea to attack on the light squares. This position is actually even better for black. But here there's also the idea to play the move d3 first, attacking the queen and the bishop, and after queen to e2, black can take the knight, although after queen takes, black will counterattack on e5, or even simple again, now take the knight. There's a lot of ideas to attack the king, so black has a lot of activity in this position and full control of the light squares, so this position is actually quite bad for white. So in the game, Krasenkov went for e takes d5, and now Naka took on d4, which is the main idea. And here Krasenkov played a very interesting idea to keep the game going and went knight to b5, with the idea to either capture on d4 or go d6, so black has to be a bit careful. Here black could take on b5, but white gets this intermediate move d takes e6, and we get quite a messy position. So here Naka took the pawn on d5, and after knight takes and rook to c8, we see how this pin on c4 is actually quite annoying. So here white continued with rook to e1, here Naka played b5, insisting on this pin, so white cannot capture with the c pawn. And after bishop to b2, here Naka played the move rook to e8. It makes sense, this rook on f8 was quite passive. So here there's a recurring idea of taking on c4. For example, after b takes c4, taking with the d pawn is actually not good because after knight to c6, white is winning material. But after b takes c4 and b takes c4, here black can win a pawn. For example, taking with the bishop is probably not that strong because after knight takes, rook takes, and a move like queen to d1, white gets some compensation with these two very strong bishops. And again in this position, after d takes c6, the move knight to c6, which is an idea that we see later in the game, in this particular position it is quite annoying because white is attacking the queen and the bishop on e7. So here after rook to e8, Krasenkov broke the pin by going queen to d1, and after pawn takes and pawn takes, again if d takes c4, knight to c6 is annoying, and Naka doesn't want to give this bishop on a6 by going bishop takes e4, because white would take with the knight. So here Naka went for queen to b6, which makes sense because it attacks the bishop, and it also controls the c6 square. So here in this position, Krasenkov's idea was to go rook to b1, the rook on b1 is eyeing the queen on b6, but Naka is a very concrete player, and in this particular position he went for the move d takes c6. So Krasenkov saw this idea, and his idea was to follow up with knight to c6, attacking the bishop on e7, and the idea is to take on f6, creating a discover attack against the queen on b6. But Naka saw further and went rook takes c6. Here white takes on c6 after queen takes, black is simply winning material, but Krasenkov's idea was to follow up with bishop takes f6. And black's position actually looks desperate because a lot of pieces are hanging, the rook on c6, the bishop on e7, and more importantly the queen on b6. And here comes the shocker. Out of nowhere, white's king is now going to be under attack, and Naka played the move queen takes f2. So here white has to capture the queen. If king to h1, black simply captures on f6 with the rook, and after king takes, black is having a totally losing position if not for the move bishop to c5. So the bishop on e7 is pinned, but bishop to c5 gives a check, and now the king is surprisingly very badly placed. White doesn't have a lot of logical moves. Rook to e3 covers the check, but it loses the rook. In the game, Krasenkov went for king to f3, and after king to f1, again out of nowhere, now this bishop on a6 becomes a very strong attacking piece. After c3, now white is already losing material. For example, after rook to e2, which is the only logical way to cover the check. In addition to taking on e2, black might even play the move c2 first, forking these two pieces, and after queen takes, bishop takes, white is just either getting checkmated or losing a lot of material after king to e1 and bishop to d3, which gives a check and attacks the queen. So in the game, white tried king to f3, and after rook takes f6, we see how this king is now getting further away. King to g4, Naka continued with knight to e5, giving a check. And regardless of the lines, we can see how black is just having a lot of pieces trying to attack the king. This bishop might come back to c8, also this bishop might come to e7 in some lines. So all of black pieces are going to attack white's king, which is quite isolated on g4. So white's position is actually quite desperate. We can check some lines here. White tried king to g5, but if the king goes to the h-file, one idea is to give a few checks after rook to h6 and rook to g6. If the king goes to f4, knight to d3 is very strong. If the king goes to f5, bishop to c8 will bring another attacker. And if the king goes to the h-file again, now black can simply bring more pieces, and white is simply not in time to defend. For example, after knight to e4, bishop to e7 is a very nice move, planning to go rook to h6, checkmate. So here Krasenkov went king to g5, and after rook to g6 and king to h5, Naka tried another idea to checkmate by going f6, so black can even play quiet moves in this position, despite being materially down. So here rook to h6 checkmate is just a huge threat. Krasenkov continued for just a few moves after rook takes and rook takes, king to h4, and now again bishop to c8. In this position, not waiting for rook to h6, Krasenkov decided to resign. So I hope that you enjoyed this crazy game. If you want to get better at chess, you might want to check my free course in the description that will provide you with a training plan. That's it for now. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.